Every murder has a victim. Every victim has a story. It starts and ends in the dead of night. The city of San Diego glimmers in what seems to be eternal sunshine. And when the sun goes down, the night comes alive with crowds at a constellation of bars and clubs.
It's a great place to live. You know, it's a beach community and everybody's pretty laid back.
Which is why no one could have predicted the unspeakable crime that unfolded late one winter night. It was around 4:30 a.m., 2 days before Christmas, when a car exploded into flames on San Diego's La Jolla Scenic Drive.
The fire department was advised by some residents in the area that they had heard an explosion.
Fire department shows up, there's a car on fire, and they just think it's, you know, an accident.
And they observed the vehicle on the side of the road, well involved in flame, with flame height of estimated approximately 20 feet.
After the blaze is put out, firefighters make a gruesome discovery. A charred body inside the wreckage. At daylight, investigators sift the scene for evidence.
The body was found on the passenger seat. The passenger seat had been reclined fully, so the body was essentially prone, but the body was also face down. Not a situation where you would expect somebody who was a passenger in a vehicle.
It's been quite an extensive fire that really did a lot of damage and destroyed potentially almost any kind of possibility of evidence in the car.
It's unheard of for something like this to be discovered here. La Jolla, which means the jewel in Spanish, is one of the wealthiest enclaves in San Diego. Its scenic drive winds up to the top of Mount Soledad with its breathtaking views of the city and the ocean. But it has little traffic at night.
This particular road at 4 in the morning was virtually deserted. There was a very strong odor consistent with gasoline coming from the passenger compartment of the vehicle. It was clear that the fire started in the passenger compartment, not in the engine compartment.
The body is burned beyond recognition. It will take dental records to identify these remains.
You couldn't tell the race, you couldn't tell the age, you couldn't even tell what kind of clothing the individual had been wearing because it had all been consumed in the fire.
But investigators are able to glean some things at the scene. A detective notes the body has a striking injury.
What I thought was remarkable is there clearly was a skull fracture, which was kind of consistent with bullet holes.
It looks like the victim was shot in the head. It also appears that the car fire was no accident.
This was, in fact, an incendiary or an intentionally set fire. In layman's terms, it was an arson fire.
Detectives run the vehicle's tags.
There was a Kansas license plate on the car, and I was able to learn that the registered owner was a David Stevens.
He also finds out that 38-year-old David Stevens has an address in the Pacific Beach area, less than 5 miles from the crime scene.
Hello.
A building manager lets detectives into David's apartment.
Is this a picture of Mr. Stevens? Oh, yeah, that's him. What do you got?
There's no one inside and no sign of a struggle. The apartment is meticulously neat, but 2 used glasses have been left on a table. One has a lipstick stain on the rim.
In the bedroom, they found some very telling things.
The bed was unmade, which seemed out of character for this very neat apartment. He had a mirrored headboard, and we had these fingered and palm prints on the headboard of very small hands. We assumed that they may be a female's hands. We also found some long black hairs in the sink.
It was clear there was an intimate relationship between Mr. Stevens and some woman in the hours preceding the murder.
At this point, we're not really sure what David Stevens' role here is. He's missing. Our first goal is to see if we can establish if David Stevens is alive.
The manager leads police downstairs to the apartment where David's boss, Carl Withrow, lives.
They asked me if I knew David Stevens, and when they did, I immediately just thought he was in some type of trouble.
He was devastated to the point that he's crying, he's physically upset that the idea that David may, in fact, have been murdered.
I was stunned.
We found his car.
I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I couldn't believe what they were telling me. I had just spoke to him the night before.
The detectives are taken aback by Carl's emotional reaction.
I talked to him about 8 or 9 last night.
They wondered if Carl maybe had somehow been involved and this was an act.
By his own admission, Carl is one of the last people to talk to David.
He told me that David had worked the night before and that he was supposed to get off about 9 p.m. So we basically knew that David was alive at least at 9 p.m. the night before.
But Carl says he didn't hear David come in the night before. Detectives call in a forensic team to carefully gather the evidence in David's apartment. The next day, on Christmas Eve, dental records confirm the victim is David Stevens.
The autopsy also revealed that he had suffered 2 gunshot wounds to the head, and that was in fact what killed him.
It also noted that David was dead before the fire was set. The case is now officially a homicide, and detectives looking to solve David's murder probe deeper into his life. They learn David, a telemarketer, moved from Kansas to San Diego less than a year earlier. A native of Nebraska, David had always yearned for a life filled with sunshine on the beach.
His whole life, he wanted to come to California. He wanted to live in California. When he landed in San Diego, he was exactly where he wanted to be. He enjoyed everything about it.
David was close friends with his boss, Carl Withrow.
We lived right between La Jolla and Pacific Beach. We had a beautiful ocean view. He kept himself in good shape. We were on the beach almost every day. When we weren't at work, David was a workaholic. He loved to work. He was very good at what he did.
David,
But there was something missing from the good life in San Diego. Romance.
Hi, my name is David Stevens. I'm from Nebraska, new here to San Diego, and I'm looking for a girl with a great smile and enjoys long walks on the beach.
Carl ran a dating agency called Perfect Match. David originally came in as a client.
David was at a point in his life where he was trying to find someone to share his life with. He was very serious, very sincere about finding someone to date, enjoy, and eventually marry.
Interviews, and I moved out here with all my telemarketing experience. I was hired on there as a manager. Absolutely.
As it happened, Carl had been looking for a new telemarketing manager and offered the job to David.
Just probably one of the greatest guys that I'd ever met. Very honest, very sincere, just an all-around good person.
David Stevens seemed like the last person anyone would want to kill. Yet police think there are probably 2 people connected with his murder. Given the remote spot where the car was found, investigators believe the perpetrator would have needed help to escape undetected.
There had to be more than one person involved in this case, and more than one vehicle, a getaway vehicle, if you will. The suspect had to get away.
Experience tells investigators that the killer is likely to be a man.
Statistics have shown that men are by far more likely to commit an arson fire than a female. And in the case of vehicle fire and a homicide, the cases I've worked, it's never involved a female suspect. It's always involved male suspects.
Yet police believe a woman plays some role in the case. DNA tests confirm David had sex with a female in his apartment the night he was killed.
Did they enjoy each other's company and then she left and has no idea what happened, or is she somehow involved in this?
And if so, did she have help? If not, who was the one who killed David Stevens?
There is one important break. Phone records show that someone called David from the security phone in his lobby on the night he was killed.
We learned that someone buzzed his apartment at about 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, that's all we know. There was no security cameras, there's no caller ID or anything like that.
The visitor called just an hour and a half before the car carrying David's body went up in flames on La Jolla Scenic Drive in the dead of night. Coming up, police turn up the heat and have someone in their sights.
I was probably their #1 suspect.
"38-year-old David Stevens has been brutally shot to death. His charred body was found in a burning vehicle. Arson investigators believe that the killer would have been burnt too.
The suspect stood right next to the vehicle and threw in some type of burning material. And it's the vapors that ignite, not the liquid itself.
The explosion would have flash burned the person who lit the fire. It's a clue that may come in handy, but for now, doesn't help identify a suspect.
We did have officers check all the local hospitals, and they didn't report any burn victims.
Although his friends thought David wasn't dating anyone, evidence says otherwise.
The fingerprints that we found off the headboard did not belong to David Stevens. So we have a mystery female that's been in this apartment.
But the tantalizing clue of the fingerprints on the headboard fails to shed light on who killed David Stevens. Investigators comb all of the local and national databases, but find no match. David's co-workers aren't much help either.
Were you friends with David?
We're never outside the office.
You don't think that he was dating anybody here or was interested in anybody?
No.
He wasn't anything other than the boss. No one had known him to date anybody, not to even really go out and party with anybody, other than his boss.
Detectives circle back to David's own boss and what they consider to be his overly distraught reaction to David's death.
Gentlemen, how can I help you? Just had a few follow-up questions for you.
They would come into my office 2 or 3 times a week, asking the craziest of questions.
Was he by any chance?
It became very apparent that these questions were somewhat accusatory, and that I was certainly under suspicion of having something to do with it.
Sergeant Martin here.
I sort of recall a telephone conversation with him, and what I told him was, everybody's a suspect and everybody's a witness.
Carl, we'd like you to take a lie detector test.
I spoke to a friend of mine that was an attorney. He said, this is a capital murder case. If you go in and fail this lie detector test, you could end up in prison. That's enough to scare anyone.
Nevertheless, he agrees to the polygraph and passes. The police conclude he is not involved and turn